All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Alberta Lymphedema Association Education Night. We're very excited to have two amazing speakers with us this evening. As one of the board members of the Alberta Lymphedema Association, as well as a certified lymphedema therapist, I am very excited to hear the presentations that are going to be shown tonight. So I'm going to introduce you to both of our speakers. Our first speaker is Catharine Bowman, and she is a master's student in the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health at Stanford University and MD student at the University of Calgary. In 2007, Catharine's mother was diagnosed with lymphedema, leading Catharine to promise her mother that she would one day develop a pharmacological treatment for her mother's incurable disease. By the age of 15, Catharine founded a national team of clinicians and scientists to pursue this work across Canada. And today, Catharine's research focuses on the epidemiology of lymphatic disease, lymphedema therapeutics, psychosocial manifestations, and surgical treatment of lymphedema. And through her speaking campaign, which is Let's Talk Lymphedema, Catharine has presented on lymphedema internationally. Catharine completed her Bachelor of Health Sciences at the University of Calgary as one of 5 President's Award recipients in 2020. And she's been named one of Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30, one of Calgary's top 40 Under 40 by Avenue magazine, and was selected as one of 13 women in the world to join the Rising Talents Network in Paris, France. In 2022, Catharine was awarded the Knight Hennessy Scholarship to pursue graduate studies at Stanford University. We also have this evening presenting is Dr. Stanley Rockson. He is the Alan and Tina Neal Professor of Lymphatic Research and Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. After earning his medical degree from Duke University School of Medicine, Dr. Rockson completed his internship and residency training in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital of Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts, and the fellowship training in the cardiac unit of Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He is a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, Society of Vascular Medicine, American College of Angiology, and American College of Physicians, as well as a member of the International Society of Lymphology, American Society of International Medicine, and the Paul Dudley White Society, among others. As a principal investigator or co-investigator, he has been involved in numerous clinical trials, researching various aspects of lymphatic disease, vascular biology, and cardiovascular medicine. His basic research involves the investigation of disease pathogenesis and the identification of biomarkers of lymphatic diseases, as well as research into molecular and pharmacological therapeutics. As a professor of medicine, Dr. Rockson serves concurrently as the Stanford's Chief of Consultative Cardiology and the Director of the Stanford Center for Lymphatic and Venous Disorders. Dr. Rockson is editor-in-chief of Lymphatic Research and Biology and sits on the editorial board of Angiology. Dr. Rockson works closely with the National Institute of Health in an advisory capacity to advance the agenda for lymphatic research, and he has been a frequent invited lecturer at national and international meetings, congresses, and societies. He's a co-founder of the Lymphatic Education and Research Network, and has served as chair of the inaugural Gordon Research Conference entitled Molecular Mechanisms in Lymphatic Function and Disease. He is the co-author of Lymphedema, a concise compendium of theory and practice, now in its 2nd edition. Dr. Rockson has authored more than 250 scientific papers, reviews, book chapters, and books devoted to various aspects of lymphatic biology and disease, vascular biology, and cardiovascular medicine. So if you were worried that maybe you could be doing something else on this Monday evening, you were in for a surprise, because these are amazing speakers with so much education and information to share with us. And I am very proud to introduce our first speaker for the evening. Please welcome Catharine Bowman.
Thank you very much, Robin, for the kind introduction and again for having us this evening. So I'll just start by sharing my screen here. And go into presentation mode. Wonderful. Okay. And I'm going to do this so that you don't have to look at me too much. We can look at the slides. And yes, once again, so hi everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to present part one of our talk this evening, to hopefully give in this portion, a bit of a lay of the land, so to speak, about looking at lymphedema patient perceptions and subjective outcomes within the healthcare system, and doing this from a quantitative population lens. So we'll get going here and just advance. Woo, apologies. Make sure we can advance our slides. Okay, there we are. So actually, before I go much further, I do first off just want to acknowledge that I do reside and I work on the ancestral land of the Mwekma Ohlone tribe, and that I've also had the honor of studying medicine, as mentioned, on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So for tonight's presentation, I feel in many ways that I'm speaking to the people who, unfortunately do know this fact quite well, but that our research and clinical experiences have shown us that lymphedema patients, are quite frequently encountering a lack of awareness of lymphatic disease, lymphedema, and the lymphatic system when interacting with the healthcare system. And more recently, we've coined this term lymphatic ignorance to help us describe this experience that patients continue to encounter in the medical system. And we have, a number of smaller studies, observational studies, interviews, and qualitative type of studies that have been able to document this experience of patients. But right now, we really have minimal epidemiologic or population level evidence that helps us to quantify, the impact of this disease neglect and how that's impacting patients. And so that's the goal of the study that I'm going to be presenting this evening, is we were working to characterize the clinical traits and the interactions of lymphedema patients within the healthcare system. We went about this using a 23 question online survey, and this was anonymously distributed to patients with self-identified lymphedema. So they may have been, say, diagnosed by a physician, and then they're reporting to us, I do have lymphedema, or have come to that conclusion through other means. And this questionnaire was distributed through social media in partnership with lymphedema organizations, namely the Lymphatic Education and Research Network, with the goal of trying to reach as many lymphedema patients as possible. We were collecting data on clinical traits, healthcare experiences, and patients' level of satisfaction with their lymphedema care, as well as quality of life. And so, as mentioned tonight, what we would actually like to do is get a sense of the audience for this talk, how your experiences compare to the participants in our large-scale study. And so we're going to try to do a bit of an interactive poll to try to engage you all in learning about your experiences more. And so we're going to be using a platform called Poll Everywhere to run a survey throughout our talk tonight. And there's two ways that you can participate if you have lymphedema. The first is via your telephone, your cell phone. And so what we would invite you to do is, in order to participate in the poll, you basically start a new text message in your cell phone. And so hopefully you have a phone or something nearby to do this. So you open up a new text message, and then you text to the number 37607. You will text this text here. So it's C Bowman 671. And that will help you join our session. So it should send you a little text message back that said you've joined Catharine Bowman's session. And as I activate questions on our platform about, your lymphedema experience, you'll have a couple of different letter options, and you can actually just answer the poll by texting in a letter each time. So it'll correspond to whatever question I'm asking at that time. For folks who are, say, your cell phone plan is that you have to pay for every text, or you have a limited number of texts, or that you can't text into the States without incurring a charge, we can also participate via the web. And you can still actually do this on your phone, and we would encourage that, so you don't have to flip between the Zoom screen and your laptop browser. So basically just opening your Google browser or your Safari search. And in the search bar, the website you'll go to is pollev.com/cbowman671. And I'm just going to leave that up there for a minute so that folks can get set, and then we can do a bit of a trial question for everyone. All right. So with each slide also just across the top bar as well, you should be able to see that you can text cbowman671 to this number, and then here you can answer the questions. So I'm just going to go ahead and try to activate our first question here. And I see that we have some participants already participating. That's wonderful. So the question is specific to folks who have cancer-related lymphedema. Did your healthcare provider discuss lymphedema risk prior to surgery? And I'll just give that a little bit of time so that we can all participate. Great. All right. So I'm just going to close off this question. So if you're debating an answer, we'll get the final answer in there. Awesome. Thank you. Great. Okay. So that's question going to close off now. And we'll go to the next question, which I will show on a slide here. So for, again, folks who are experiencing cancer-related lymphedema, how often were you tested to detect early lymphedema during cancer treatment? So you can go ahead and answer now. All right. And if anyone's just kind of waiting to put an answer in, I'm going to flip to our next question in just a moment. All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question here is it one, again, for folks with cancer-related lymphedema, from the start of your cancer treatment to the first symptoms of your lymphedema, how long did this take? Great. And I'm starting to see things level out here. So again, I'll move to the next question. If anyone is kind of waiting on an answer, feel free to put that answer in now. All right, closing off this question. Our next question here is going to be for individuals with cancer lymphedema. My lymphedema was diagnosed by. And so there's a couple different options there. My cancer surgeon, my radiation oncologist, my primary care physician, another specialist, or a doctor never made a diagnosis. All right, I'm seeing things kind of level. If anyone's waiting to put their answer in, just kind of wrap up this question here. Great. And then the next one here is now a question for everyone. So no matter the type of lymphedema that you have, before the diagnosis of lymphedema was confirmed, I saw, and there's 1 doctor, 2 doctors, 3 doctors, 4 doctors, 5 or more doctors. Right. And I apologize because I think our ordering got a little bit messed up there. So I'm just going to re-ask the question. So if you can put your answer in again, before the diagnosis of lymphedema was confirmed, I saw, and then there's the number of doctors listed: 1, 2 doctors, 3 doctors, 4 doctors, 5 or more. Yes, and thank you to the participant who just mentioned they had a different question. That was my apologies for that. Okay. So we'll just wrap up this question here. And our next question here is, have you been referred by a healthcare professional to a lymphedema therapist? And the options are yes, no, I have never seen a lymphedema therapist, or C, I referred myself. And Elsa, thank you for your, or Elisa, pardon me. Thank you for your question. I'm going to say I would leave that up to your interpretation. Our whole goal is to emulate, what happened for people filling out this survey. They wouldn't necessarily have the researchers' clarification of that question. So I'll let you interpret whether a lymphedema therapist is a massage therapist, if that's all right. All right, and if anyone has an answer left to put in, I'm going to deactivate this question and move to the next one. Great, thank you. And then this next question here is the time between symptom onset of your lymphedema and lymphedema treatment. Wonderful. So if anyone else has an answer to put in, I'm going to deactivate the question. Great. Five more seconds. Awesome. All right. And the final question, just for the kind of the pre questions before we show you some of the data, is just confirming whether you have participated in this poll that was distributed via social media, whether you participated in our study actually before. So if these questions are looking like, oh, I've already answered these via a social media poll, please answer accordingly, just so we know if folks have been a part of our larger data set. Excuse me. Awesome. Okay, so I'll just let folks wrap up asking or answering that question there, and I'll keep that open so that you can continue to do so. And I'll move into the portion of the presentation where, keep your cell phones or your technology nearby, because we are going to continue to ask questions throughout the presentation. But let's share some results. So for context, we had 2,154 participants who actually started the questionnaire in our larger study, and about 1,805 participants completed it. So about 84% of our participants. And that was the goal, was to make the questionnaire accessible and feasible to complete, so we could get as many people as possible. We did note that 6 individuals did identify as not having lymphedema, so they were not included in the final analysis. And the majority of our participants did have a history of cancer, so about 53%, but for the most part, we had a pretty even distribution of cancer-related and non-cancer-related lymphedema patients. So I'll start by presenting some of the cancer-related lymphedema data. And again, we're actually going to ask you whether some of these data align with your personal experience with your lymphedema as well. So keep your cell phones nearby. The first slide here is demonstrating that the majority of our participants, about 65% of folks who had cancer-related lymphedema, did report receiving both radiation and a lymph node removal associated with their cancer treatment. So this was, somewhat expected based upon what we know about risk factors for lymphedema development. We had about 28% of folks who only had a lymph node removal only, and then 4% with radiation therapy only, and about 3% of people who actually had neither therapy. So I'm actually going to open up a poll about this data shortly. I apologize, I'm doing 2 things at once with the polling system. But basically our next slide here, what it's telling us is about before receiving cancer treatment, whether patients were receiving education on cancer-related lymphedema. And unfortunately, we did see that about 66% of folks reported not receiving, having had a discussion with their healthcare provider about cancer-related lymphedema before their cancer treatment was initiated. About 6% of participants did not receive educational materials on lymphedema prior to their cancer treatment. So again, this is a particularly important time in which we can instill some lymphedema education and make people aware of lymphedema as a potential outcome of their cancer therapy. So as mentioned, for the folks who are living with cancer-related lymphedema, we did want to ask whether you feel this concept, so not having had a discussion with your healthcare provider about lymphedema before your cancer treatment was initiated, as well as not receiving educational materials about lymphedema prior to your cancer treatment, whether that aligns with your personal experience. So we have a poll open for those with cancer-related lymphedema. Right, and I'm seeing the numbers kind of even out here. So if you need to submit a response, I'll encourage you to do so. We'll keep on time tonight as well. Yes, here, for folks who can't see the slide too well, I'll just remind you, here is the data here. It's about 66% did not report having a discussion with their healthcare provider about lymphedema before undergoing their cancer treatment. About 86% of people did not receive educational materials on lymphedema prior to cancer treatment. Just to remind you of what that slide was saying. Okay. So I'm seeing things even out here, so I'm just going to deactivate this question so that we can move forward to the next one. Wonderful. So in terms of pre-treatment care, so what we noticed is about 90% of participants who had cancer-related lymphedema reported not receiving compression prior to their cancer treatment, as opposed to the 10% who did. And so in terms of some of the updated international guidelines for approaches to intervening for patients with cancer-related lymphedema, this has been stated as a potential area of intervention. So we're kind of curious to see. And again, the majority of participants did not receive compression. We also noticed that about 76% of our participants with cancer-related lymphedema reported never being questioned about their lymphedema, which is shown here on the left, or being examined for lymphedema during cancer treatment. And that was about 79% of participants who stated that they experienced that. We also noted that 88% of participants with cancer-related lymphedema reported never being tested for early detection of lymphedema. And as we know, the earliest that we can intervene on lymphedema and identify it, the better off, of course, the patient would be. So it's a particularly important time in and around the cancer intervention time or treatment time that we can instill this sense of urgency of looking for lymphedema. As you will see later, many people's lymphedema obviously has presented itself actually quite early on in their cancer journeys. So I'm going to open our next poll here, and I appreciate you bearing with me as we kind of work on this system. And so it's asking you here for folks with cancer-related lymphedema, whether this concept of never being tested for early detection of lymphedema aligns with your personal experience. Right. And I'll keep that poll open for folks as I continue to present the data so we can make sure we get through it all for you. But continue to answer as you can. So moving forward, for those who were tested with lymphedema, the majority were assessed by tape measure. So that was about 38% of participants. However, once again, about 57% of people were not assessed for lymphedema. So this is moving beyond the early detection phase and now moving into, how were you tested, if at all, for lymphedema? 57% of people said they were not tested, 38% with tape measure, and then about 5% composing the remainder. In terms of symptom onset for cancer-related lymphedema patients, about 60% of folks did develop their symptoms within 12 months of cancer treatment. And as you can see here, there is a fair proportion who actually developed it within even 1 month or within the 6-month range. Once again, emphasizing the importance of having lymphedema on care providers' minds so that they can identify these symptoms and signs of lymphedema and get people into the therapy that they need in order to have good sustained management. So we'll also ask folks with cancer-related lymphedema who are joining us tonight to just speak to whether this concept of developing your lymphedema within that 12-month mark, whether that describes your personal experience well. Wonderful. All right. I'll keep that question open and just continue with the slides to keep us on time. Thank you. Here we're looking at lymphedema diagnosis. So 50% of our participants were diagnosed by a specialist who was not their cancer surgeon, was not their radiation oncologist, their primary care doc, but in fact was another specialist. And once again, we had about 16% of people saying, that a doctor had never made a diagnosis for them. I think this is interesting because oftentimes with cancer-related lymphedema, we may focus on the cancer-related care path for patients. But I think this slide also emphasizes that when we are trying to create educational interventions for both healthcare providers and patients, that we truly do need to have a widespread approach, and that lymphedema can be diagnosed in a variety of different disciplines in the medical system. All right, so once again, I'm going to activate a question just to ask folks how this particular slide aligns with their personal experience with cancer-related lymphedema. Wonderful. All right, and I will keep this question open for folks to roll their answers in, and move forward with presenting. Now moving actually into more combined data. So looking at both cancer-related and non-cancer-related lymphedema patients. What was the picture here? So one of the questions we asked was, who was the first person to notice your lymphedema symptoms? I think what's particularly interesting is that there is a significantly greater proportion of individuals with cancer-related lymphedema reporting that they themselves were the first person to notice their lymphedema, whereas in the non-cancer-related lymphedema group, there is a significantly greater proportion of individuals who are reporting external groups being kind of the first people to identify their lymphedema. So a doctor, a care provider, family member, or friend. I think this could speak to a little bit to the fact that, primary lymphedemas that may be developing earlier in life, in infancy or childhood, there may be a parent or a care provider more likely to notice these symptoms up front. But I think it does emphasize that there is certainly a difference between the cancer-related and non-cancer-related groups from this standpoint. The next piece here is looking at the time between lymphedema symptom onset and when a diagnosis was received. And so as you can see, for folks with cancer-related lymphedema in the white bar here, significantly greater proportion were reporting receiving a diagnosis for lymphedema within about the 3-month mark. What is also particularly interesting here is that as we move obviously further in time, less and less cancer-related lymphedema patients were reporting having to wait, say, greater than 12 months before receiving their diagnosis. But in the case of non-cancer-related lymphedema patients, this is where we begin to see, pretty significant proportion of folks were waiting longer than 12 months between the time that their lymphedema symptoms set in and when they actually received a formal diagnosis. So there's quite a delay as well as a difference between the two groups here. And so for everyone in the audience, I'll now pose a question of how these data relate to your experience and align with your personal experience, whether you have cancer-related or non-cancer-related lymphedema. Awesome. So I'll keep this open for folks to continue to answer on their devices. We also asked, similar to what we asked you this evening, how many doctors participants saw before receiving a lymphedema diagnosis. And when we looked at the cancer-related lymphedema group, the majority, about 54% of participants actually only needed to see one physician prior to receiving a diagnosis. But this was starkly different than what was being experienced by the non-cancer-related lymphedema patients, where a significantly greater proportion of individuals with non-cancer-related lymphedema were reporting having to see 4, 5 or more doctors before receiving that lymphedema diagnosis. So we look at education and points of intervention to ultimately improve lymphatic healthcare. We can see that there's folks who are seeing many different physicians that through hopefully education, we would be able to decrease that number of doctors that needs to be seen for patients prior to receiving a formal diagnosis with lymphedema. So I'll once again ask everyone to just relating to their own experience, how these data relate to your experience with either cancer-related or non-cancer-related lymphedema in terms of the number of doctors that you had to see before getting a diagnosis. All right, and I'll keep that question open for folks who are still thinking about their answers. This slide here relates to referral to a lymphedema therapist or to a therapist. So the majority of our participants had been referred to a lymphedema therapist, and evenly across both cancer-related and non-cancer-related lymphedema groups, we saw that patients were primarily self-referring. About 22% of individuals in both groups were reporting this, whereas for those who were referred to a therapist, a significantly greater proportion in the cancer-related group reported actually having that referral compared to the non-cancer-related lymphedema group. So once again, this may be a reflection of the number of times that each group of individuals may be interacting with the care system, or the infrastructure that has been built out in the context of life after cancer care. And really, I think emphasizes the need to develop a stronger infrastructure so that we can get non-cancer related lymphedema patients into the care lines that they deserve, so that they can also see a therapist as well. So once again, I'll just deactivate this question here and reactivate a question about this referral slide and ask you whether these data align with your personal experience about being referred to a lymphedema therapist. Wonderful. So I'll leave that question open for people. So another question that we had asked participants is basically the time between when their lymphedema symptoms presented themselves and when they actually received lymphedema treatment. And as you can see from the data, basically the majority of cancer-related lymphedema patients did receive treatment within that 3-month window, and that was significantly greater than the number of folks with non-cancer related lymphedema that reported this. If we move across the graph here, we see less and less cancer-related lymphedema patients reporting, say, having to wait greater than a year before receiving their treatment after symptoms onset, because in many ways, this area, unfortunately, non-cancer related lymphedema patients were having to wait longer than a year before receiving their treatment after their lymphedema symptoms set in. So I think what's interesting to me about this slide is in many ways, it emphasizes this need, obviously, for lymphedema treatment, but also that there is a very unique experience for both cancer-related and non-cancer-related groups. And I think that as we look at the distribution of our research, increasing our ability to study these groups together, but also in their unique experiences is particularly important, so that we can develop interventions that are tailored to the lived experiences of each group and the unique needs of each group. So the final 3 questions that we asked here were actually kind of a sliding scale style question. And so this allowed participants to, in this example, speak to their quality of life and functional impact that lymphedema has had on them. And so they could say, lymphedema didn't have particularly strong effect or impact on my quality of life and functional impact. Or they could go all the way to the other end and put a tick here and say, actually had a devastating quality of life and functional impact as a result of my lymphedema. And so what we're seeing in the data, we did an analysis that looked at both cancer-related and non-cancer-related groups separately and also just combined as well. And in the combined data, ultimately what the data are showing us is that no matter your type of lymphedema, our participants did have answers that were skewed towards the devastating side or a devastating impact that lymphedema had upon their quality of life and functional impact. And actually the folks in the non-cancer related lymphedema group were reporting higher scores on this scale, which mean kind of more skew towards that devastating impact of lymphedema on quality of life and functional status. We also asked about patients' perceived interest of their physician on their lymphedema. So physician interest in lymphedema, they could be very concerned or feel as though their physician was uninterested. Once again, looking at kind of the group combined, patients' scores did actually skew towards physician disinterest in their lymphedema, and that this was actually quite similar between cancer-related and non-cancer-related lymphedema groups, emphasizing, the need to recognize that, if patients are feeling as though their physicians are not interested in lymphedema, it's important to study that and recognize, where is this coming from? Is it from the physician end? Is there lack of awareness that we need to increase? Or is there other factors? Are there other factors at play here that we need to study? The final question on this survey looked at patient satisfaction with their lymphedema diagnosis and treatment. And I think that this is actually an excellent summary slide in a lot of ways to look at whether a patient has been satisfied with their care thus far or dissatisfied. And what the answer, or excuse me, the data is essentially demonstrating to us is that patients are ultimately dissatisfied with their lymphedema diagnosis and treatment. And it really does go to show that we have a lot of work to be done in order to improve the satisfaction of the care and hopefully improve patient outcomes as we continue to intervene in the lymphatic healthcare realm. So just some conclusions and discussion to wrap up here. So as we've discussed, and I think many of us do know, that lymphedema does have a substantial impact on people's well-being, and yet patients continue to face these barriers, these delays in care that are preventing them from receiving optimal lymphatic health care. This study was the first kind of formal attempt to quantify and validate these patient interactions and level of dissatisfaction within the healthcare system from a population lens. Again, we had about 1,800 people provide their answers to us, and we're really seeing that we need research and reform so that we can improve our lymphatic education and lymphatic healthcare. And when I put all of these data kind of together as I see them, so looking at all the different questions that we ask, I ultimately see a bit of a flow chart in terms of patient care that looks kind of like this. For folks with cancer-related lymphedema, we have all these different points of interaction that the patient has within the oncologic centers, as well as with their primary care docs and other specialists. And as much as these are points of interaction with the healthcare system, I think in a lot of ways, these are points of intervention so that we can improve our lymphatic healthcare as patients are interacting with the healthcare system. For primary non-cancer related lymphedema patients, again, we see some of these clocks coming into play as well, where patients are quite delayed in having access to a diagnosis and having access to treatment. And the more that we can intervene at these points of delay for both groups, the better that we can get people into a status of sustained self-management for their lymphedema. So kind of wrapping up here, I'm actually going to return us now to our initial questions that we had asked you all, with the hopes to just see if your answers kind of aligned with what you had previously said and what we had recorded in your first answers after listening to this talk. So I've just opened a new question here that you will all see. And so this is, again, the same questions we asked you at the beginning, but we're hoping that you can then re-answer these questions after having listened to our talk. Awesome. So we'll let folks kind of slide the rest of their answers in there before the next question. Right. Thank you. And so the next question here is, again, for folks who were experiencing cancer-related lymphedema, how often were you tested to detect early lymphedema during cancer treatment? So you can go ahead and put an answer there now. All right, and for folks who are needing to just slide any more answers in there, I'll move to the next question in a couple seconds. Awesome. I feel like we're a bunch of pros with this polling system now. This is good. All right, for individuals with cancer-related lymphedema, from the start of cancer treatment to the first symptoms of lymphedema, this required. Wonderful. All right. Anyone kind of slip in any last minute answers in, please do so now. Okay. Our next question here is for individuals with cancer-related lymphedema. My lymphedema was diagnosed by. So Sandy, just to answer your question, I see others do have questions in there. Our whole goal is actually to compare the pre and the post answers, even though, yes, they are the same questions. Yeah. All right, we'll move to the next one. So this question here is basically asking, and I apologize, my slides are a bit out of sync here, but from the time of first appearance of lymphedema symptoms, a diagnosis of lymphedema took. And the responses that you can include here are less than 1 month, 1 to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, or more than a year. All right. And moving to our next question here, we'll get the last one in. Thank you. Awesome. So this question is for, I apologize, just finding my correct slides. Great. Before the diagnosis of lymphedema was confirmed, I saw, and this is the number of doctors. And I would just mention for folks who might be annotating on the Zoom slides, you'll have to go directly into the Poll Everywhere software to answer that question, or else it will not get recorded. All right, and we'll move to the next question here. So the next question here is just about referral. Whether you've been referred by a healthcare professional to a lymphedema therapist. We just have one more after this. All right, so folks can, anyone who's waiting to put an answer in there, feel free to do so, and I'll move to the final question. Great. And the final one here is looking at time between symptom onset and lymphedema treatment. All right, so I will keep that question open for anyone who's kind of last minute putting any answers in there. And I'll just flip to my final slide here. Okay, oh, we have an annotation on the slide. All right, so with that, first off, I want to thank you all very much for your participation in all of the questions here. And I think, you know, if we have time, I'm happy to take questions either now, or if we wanted to wait until after Dr. Rockson's presentation, I can also answer them in the chat, whatever is best for our participants and for Dr. Rockson as well. So thank you so much for listening.
Catharine, thank you for presenting our data and doing a really good job of taking the temperature of the audience as well. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that this work was able to be done through a grant that I've participated in with the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, the CDC, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them in their role in overseeing a lot of the US experience with COVID-19, among many, many other things. But the CDC is becoming interested in lymphatic problems and lymphedema as chronic diseases, and this research was done in part to help them understand the magnitude and scope of the problem, and hopefully will guide us, in solutions. So maybe we'll get a chance to talk some more about that in the Q&A session. So let me try to open my presentation here, and we'll go to slideshows. So we're going to have, quite a shift of gears here from population-based science and experiences to an inferential research approach. And I must say, I didn't know Catharine at the time that she made the promise to her mom, but in some ways, maybe her coming to Stanford is part of the fulfillment of the promise, because I was working on this already when she was making that promise, and we've come a long way, and now we have the wonderful opportunity to work together during her graduate work. And actually, Catharine will be working with me on aspects of what I'll be talking about as part of her experience while she's at Stanford. So what I'm going to talk about is how I was motivated initially by dealing with lymphedema patients, we say at the bedside, in this case, primarily more in clinics, trying to understand the problems that they face and trying to find solutions, which took me back to my animal laboratory to do some translational investigation, which in turn led to some clues that we were able to follow. And now we are back at the bedside again, trying to develop a drug for lymphedema that will be commercially available. Let's see, do I advance my slide here? Sorry, I've lost my little advance button. Let's see how we can do this. There it is. Okay. So I think everybody here tonight knows about this problem. This is a particularly advanced version of it, but suffice it to say, as I've gone through this, the solution that we found works even for patients who've had lymphedema for many decades, as you see here. Now, when I entered this field and I started taking care of lymphedema patients in the early 1990s, the prevailing concept was that the lymphatics are the sewer system of the body. That could not be more incorrect, but that ignorance about how the lymphatics function has helped to foster the ignorance about how to effectively treat it. The lymphatic system is not just a dumping ground that flows off, into the ocean to get rid of all of the waste. It is actually a very actively modulated system that is perfecting the internal environment in which the cells operate based upon what the circulation is able to deliver to them. So as we think about lymphedema, which is a failure of this system, we eventually need to understand how it fails and why it fails. But let's first acknowledge that lymphedema has a natural progression that we recognize, and the physical findings progress from subclinical changes that can be detected by certain kind of testing that's implied in some of the questions we asked in the questionnaire that you heard about, all the way to individuals who have so-called irreversible changes of lymphedema, which is the case as we move from stage 2 into stage 3. Now, spoiler alert, what we've discovered is that the treatment strategies that we're working on have taught us that the so-called irreversible phases of lymphedema are not irreversible. They do respond to treatment. So it really is an exciting vista to anticipate. Now, when we think about lymphedema or any edema, we start with a stage that is called pitting. And that basically means that the fluid that accumulates in the tissues that will become lymph when it enters the lymphatic circulation is freely distributed around the cells in the portion of the body that we call the interstitium, which basically means the surrounding space. And at that stage, because it is just fluid, it's a little bit like the water that you mop up with your kitchen sponge. Same idea. There are spaces in the sponge that can fill with the water. And if we squeeze the sponge, the water comes out. If we push on the limb that has pitting edema, the fluid will move, at least temporarily, because there's no barrier to that. However, one clue to the very complex nature of lymphedema is that with the passage of time, that pitting quality is almost universally lost. So you end up with a limb that has the same increase in volume as when it was pitting, but that fluid is replaced with materials that are not freely movable. And that is the dilemma of lymphedema, because we know that the physical therapies for lymphedema are very good at mobilizing fluid. We know that their interventions are very good at maintaining the effects of those interventions once they have been effective. But over time, there is a tendency for lymphedema to progress, both in magnitude and severity, and to move toward this, what has historically been called the irreversible phase, when the pitting is lost. And that biology is really what we're going to try to address with the pharmacology, because physical therapies are great for the pitting, but physical therapy has very little to offer for the non-pitting component of lymphedema. Now, the other attribute that we need to think about is when we think about lymphedema, we think about the lymphatic system, particularly as lymphedema patients, we think all about fluid movement, channels, places for fluid to go, without paying attention to the fact that the lymphatic system is actually what we can call an immunovascular network. In the process of moving fluid from the space around the cells back into the circulation, the lymphatic system has the unique ability to take the temperature of everything that's passing through it, and therein lies the power of the fluid passing through lymph nodes, where the immune system can become activated when it needs to, because the lymphatic system is telling the body what's happening at every interface with the outside world, whether it's the skin or the gastrointestinal tract or the lungs. Every place where the outside world comes in contact with the interior world, that passage requires passage through fluids that move through lymph, and thereby the immune system can absolutely regulate what is happening. And it turns out that when you have lymphedema, there is a dysregulation of this whole aspect of lymphatic function, and again, a key to what our treatment might be able to do. So with all of that as background, let's talk about developing a drug to solve this problem. So we started with an animal model. I created an animal model way back in the 1990s in which we could create lymphedema in the mouse tail. And think of the mouse tail as a kind of model for the human arm. So if we make the mouse tail edematous with lymphedema, we're simulating what happens to a human arm when lymphedema supervenes, for example, after cancer therapy with primary lymphedema or other traumas to the lymphatic system. Now, we have to be very thankful to our partners, the mice, because they give us a lot of information, and they do so without getting a vote, I'm afraid. But honestly, murine science has taught us a lot that has now brought this to the landscape of human therapy. So when we create lymphedema in the mouse tail, you see it here, we've created a surgical incision at the base of the tail. The body of the mouse will be up here. And we actually developed a technique whereby we can very accurately measure the volume of this tail simply by taking digital photographs and then doing certain geometric approximations based upon the images that we get. And we discovered that it's very, very accurate. We can detect changes in volume of as little as 100 microliters. So that's 1/10 of a milliliter increase in volume of the tail is something that I can measure reliably. And you can see that this mouse has developed, well, perhaps you don't know what mice tails look like ordinarily, but this is a swollen tail that has lymphedema, and it happens over about 7 days after we do the surgery. Now, when we look at skin under the microscope, it turns out that lymphedema skin and normal skin in the mouse tail, which is what you're looking at here, strongly resembles exactly what we see in human skin. And that therein lies the strength of the model, because we can study 20 or 30 mice and come up with a conclusion that takes us very close to what we want to do in the human situation. And that's exactly what we did. And when we look, this is a special technique of looking at the mouse skin under the microscope called immunohistochemistry, which means we use specific molecules and give them a color that we can detect under the microscope in order to tell us with certainty that a structure that we're looking at is lined by lymphatic, normal lymphatic lining cells. And so you see in this particular section of a mouse tail with lymphedema, all of this brown material that is surrounding these white lakes represents the fact that these are indeed lymphatics, and these are quite dilated lymphatics. We don't see them in normal skin because normally the lymphatics are pretty collapsed. They don't have a lot of fluid in them. Only when they're needed to expand do they do so. But in lymphedema, they become quite large because they're blocked higher up and the fluid doesn't move. So here you can see an example of normal skin lymphedema untreated with these large lymphatic lakes. And then after we treat the mouse with lymphedema, all of that dilation reverts to normal because the lymphatics basically decompress and drain as they're supposed to based upon the drug that we give. I'm getting ahead of my story because what we did way back in 2003, 2004, 2005 is to say, let's acknowledge that we're probably not going to rebuild these tiny microscopic lymphatic vessels that are disrupted by cancer therapy and radiation and other diseases. Let's try to figure out what's happening to the body when lymphedema occurs, because we know that for every person that develops lymphedema, for example, after cancer treatment, there are 2 or 3 or 4 identical patients, identical disease presentation, identical cancer treatment who do not develop lymphedema. So the key is what is happening in the tissues that don't tolerate that lymphatic damage, and is that where we can intervene? And what we found using a technique called whole genome transcriptional profiling, it's basically a way of assaying all of the molecules that the cells are expressing in response to their local environment and their local biology. We compared normal skin to lymphedema skin and found that almost all of the changes that we were able to appreciate in lymphedema had nothing to do with edema or blood vessels or lymphatic channels or anything else. It all had to do with inflammation and immunity. That's what this body was responding to when the mouse, in this case, developed lymphedema. And by the way, everything that I'm showing you in the mouse, we subsequently demonstrated in humans as well. So the mouse model proved to be very useful. And it allowed us to elaborate a scheme in which we believe that when the lymphatics are damaged, both fluid accumulation occurs and there is an abnormal function of this immune apparatus that sets up the stage for chronic inflammation and recurrent infection. And it is these 2 latter changes that lead to what is called fibrosis or scarring of the tissues, along with the deposition of excess fat under the skin, and progressive growth of the tissues that lead to that non-pitting, traditionally termed irreversible phase of lymphedema. So chronic inflammation, I'm sorry, I don't know why that's so slow. Chronic inflammation became the target of our work because we decided that what we needed to look for was a very specific anti-inflammatory agent that would block the specific signature of inflammation that we were seeing in lymphedema. So initially, I turned, based on the data we got from the transcriptional profiling, we turned to a specific drug that is called a dual anti-inflammatory agent. And what that means is it's drawn from the family of anti-inflammatories that you probably know from your neighborhood drugstore, like ibuprofen and Aleve and Advil and Motrin, and all of those drugs are called non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And all of the non-steroidals work on this blue box. They block this enzyme, which blocks this inflammatory molecule, which in turn blocks inflammation. So that's how you get rid of your headache. That's how you get rid of your arthritis pain and so on. There is one non-steroidal anti-inflammatory that's a cousin of all the others that does something very unique. It does all of this, but it also blocks another enzyme called lipoxygenase, which generates a completely different family of inflammatory molecules. And so we thought, gee, we saw evidence that there was upregulation of lipoxygenase in lymphedema. We thought, why don't we use this drug that will give us, a double whammy of treatment? We'll treat this strange molecule that we didn't expect to find, but we'll also use the traditional approach to inflammation, and maybe that will be enough to take care of it. So we chose this drug to study called ketoprofen. I want to emphasize, ketoprofen is not available over the counter. Please do not go out and buy ibuprofen or Motrin or Aleve or Advil or anything else to do this, because they don't do this. They will only treat what they normally are designed to treat. Well, what we found when we used ketoprofen in the mouse model, we treated normal animals that did not develop lymphedema because we didn't do surgery on them. Whether we gave drug or didn't give drug did not change the appearance of the skin in any way. It just simply looked normal. If we did not, if we looked at the animal prior to treatment, of course, we see these very profound changes, lots of inflammation, dilation of lymphatic channels, tremendous thickening of the skin and all the structures of the skin, all the way down to the cartilage at the center of the tail. If we gave a placebo for the drug, nothing happened. The skin looked exactly the same as you would expect. When we gave ketoprofen, we saw that in as little as 7 days, not only did the tail become inflamed and unswollen, but when we sampled the tissue, the skin reverted essentially to normal. All the lymphatic channels undilated, all of the thickening of the skin, all this excess cellular material disappeared. And basically what we saw under the microscope was a virtually normal skin specimen. So all of this is what we in human terms call the irreversible phase of lymphedema, but it's not irreversible because you can give a drug and make it go away. That was the amazing observation that we had, and that led us quite promptly to human clinical trials. And I've been using ketoprofen in patients for investigational purposes now since about 2007. Some of my patients have been on this obviously for a very long time, but it ultimately led us to a placebo-controlled clinical trial, a pilot trial, which was published a few years ago, where we looked at the effect of ketoprofen in human lymphedema. Now, we enrolled all categories of lymphedema because it is my belief that what we're looking at here is a primary manifestation of lymphedema biology. So it doesn't matter whether you got lymphedema because of cancer or because of a trauma or because of an infection or because you're harboring a gene that makes your lymphatics abnormal. We are treating the way the body deals with disturbed lymphatic function. And because of what we saw in the mouse, we decided, instead of focusing primarily on volume of the arm or the leg. By the way, we used arms and legs in this study. As traditionally, lymphedema studies look at volume as the responding agent, but we learned from the mouse that what we were seeing that was very important was changes in skin thickness that we could see under the microscope. And so we decided that clinically we could assess that by using calipers and seeing what is the smallest dimension of a skin fold that we can demonstrate in a lymphedema arm before and after treatment. So this is one of the patients we treated relatively early on in the clinical trial, and she was randomized. This was a double-blind randomized study. She was randomized to receive ketoprofen, as it turns out. This is her baseline on the left. Her skin thickness is about 35 millimeters there. Normal would be about 2. By the time she completed 6 months of treatment, her skin thickness was down to about 3 or 4 millimeters, so virtually normal. There was no other change in her treatment except that she took the unlabeled medication, which turned out to be ketoprofen, on a daily basis for 6 months. And that's what we found basically for the population group as a whole that we studied. Really, there was responsiveness across all the patient categories. Primary, secondary, arm, leg, cancer, non-cancer. And when we sampled their skin, we found that there was a dramatic improvement in the microscopic appearance of the skin as well, which is basically shown on this slide. And I'm not going to dwell on this data because we're going to run out of time. We also demonstrated, again, using that technique of immunohistochemistry, that when we gave ketoprofen, we actually blocked the expression of the enzyme that we thought we would be. And of course, this falls in line with what we thought the mechanism of our treatment would be. So with all of that, it was very gratifying. However, life threw us a bit of a curveball because the FDA, another famous actor in the COVID-19 realm, just as we were completing our studies, announced that all non-steroidal inflammatory drugs, including ketoprofen, but not limited to it, carry cardiovascular risk with long-term use. And basically, if you buy a bottle of Aleve or ibuprofen or Motrin or what have you, if you take the trouble to read the insert that comes in the box, you'll see that there is a black box warning from the FDA telling you all about how dangerous this drug is, even though people take millions of doses of this every year around the world. Well, that made us very reluctant to simply rely on ketoprofen because our thought was we would be exposing a large population of patients to chronic therapy. So we went back to the animal model because we became very curious to ask, all right, we're using a drug that blocks both of these pathways. Is it possible that ketoprofen is actually working predominantly through lipoxygenase, which means that we don't need to block the part of the action that is identical to the other NSAIDs that are used in common practice? And it turns out that the answer to that question was yes. It turns out that as we look critically at this, I don't know why my animations are very slow here, but this thunderbolt is trying to get to this molecule right here. This turns out to be the bad actor in lymphedema. It's called LTB4, and it is a product of lipoxygenase activation leading to the specific production of one of these inflammatory prostaglandins called LTB4. And what we then were able to demonstrate in a very exhaustive series of experiments published, I think in 2018, we showed that when we antagonize the production of LTB4 specifically, again, a component of what we think ketoprofen was doing without all the bad stuff, we showed that, in fact, we could reverse everything that we were concerned with. Many of you are familiar with lymphoscintigraphy or have had a lymphoscintigram where we use a nuclear technique to see the lymphatic channels. This is kind of an equivalent to a lymphoscintigram in the mouse tail, except instead of using radioactivity, we're using fluorescence. So here is the normal distribution of the lymph channels within the mouse tail. In untreated lymphedema, basically everything disappears, it falls apart, and the fluid just forms these big lakes within the tissues without doing anything else to the mouse except giving the mouse a daily dose of the drug to block LTB4, we restored the lymphatic channels and their function in as little as 7 days after administering the drug. Now, I'm not going to show you the saline control to show you that a control doesn't do anything, but I'll show you a quick movie of what's called near-infrared lymphography of the mouse tail to show you that in the whole animal, this is where the surgery was done. This is the lymphedema tail. We inject material into the tail, and I'm sorry, set it the other way. This is the tail. You're going to see the material cross the surgical wound and end up in the lymph channel on the body side of the animal. That happened sheerly because we gave the LTB4 antagonist that was allowing the lymph channels to restore themselves. And what we learned under the microscope is that when LTB4 is made in excess, which is the case in lymphedema, it blocks lymph repair mechanisms. And when we block LTB4, we restore lymph repair mechanisms, making it possible for the animal or the person to get better. And we discovered that as we looked at various compounds, only some of them were able to do what we wanted to, and many were not only didn't do it. So the big X there you see is ibuprofen. It not only didn't make things better, it made things substantially worse. The only drugs that helped us were ones that blocked the pathway that led to the production of LTB4. And this led us once again from the bench to the bedside and made us understand that what we needed to do in human patients is not worry about cyclooxygenase, none of the ibuprofen land. We were only interested in blocking LTB4. So our first, and just to tell you really quickly, we know a lot about LTB4. It binds to specific receptors on a variety of cells through the human body, including, interestingly, fat cells. And because we know that there is an overgrowth of fat in a chronically lymphodematous arm, this may represent an additional mechanism whereby this treatment will ultimately help us over and above what it does to lymphatic repair. So our first foray into this was a trial called ULTRA. You may have heard about it or read about it a few years back. Basically, it was a study of lymphedema in the leg using a relatively specific LTB4 antagonist, the same one that we used in the mouse work. Now, I got asked this question every day of my life from the time I started the trial until the present day. And the answer is, I can't give you an answer. And I specifically can't give you an answer to the ULTRA trial because the sponsor withdrew financial funding before we could complete the trial. We needed to study 250 patients. We only got to study 50 before the trial was finished. But let me tantalize you with some pictorial appetizer, shall we say. This was the last patient that we enrolled in the ULTRA trial before the trial was stopped. And basically, this was a woman who had severe lymphedema, as you see, of her left leg. She was a nurse. She had to stop working in the intensive care unit because she could no longer stand on this leg. And she enrolled in the trial, and she was randomized to the LTB4 antagonist, again, double blind. And she completed 6 months of treatment. At the end of treatment, her leg looked fantastic. She went back to school, got a master's degree, went back to nursing. And 18 months after she stopped the drug, she sent me, where is it? She sent me a picture of her legs. And you can see that not only did her leg normalize, but it has remained normal with minimal care. She continues to wear a compression garment, but she's, as I said, back to work as an ICU nurse. And for all purposes, her lymphedema is quote unquote cured. So that gave us tremendous hope. And it took some more work and some more diligence, but we are now in the midst of what we hope will be the definitive trial. Now, before I move into just a brief overview of what we're currently doing, I want everybody to understand how complex it is to run a clinical trial. If you look at that sort of dark green, I think it is, rectangle in the middle, that's me. And all the arrows that you see are all the jobs that I have to make the clinical trial be launched and brought to conclusion. And there is an extraordinary amount of oversight. In this case, I was lucky enough to get competitive funding from an organization at Stanford called the IMA, which stands for Innovative Medicines Accelerator. So its goal is to fund intramural research at Stanford that is designed to develop new medications. And thankfully, we identified a pharmaceutical sponsor who has a drug that we are interested in. They're called Celtaxis. They've provided the remainder of the funding. This trial is about a $1.5 million trial at this point, or the budget is for that, and is anticipated to be concluded towards the end of 2024. We're actively enrolling, and we've enrolled about 25% of the patient population. This particular trial is going to be conducted in patients with arm lymphedema involving one of their two arms only. The lymphedema has to be chronic, not so greater than 6 months in duration. Gender is not an issue. It's not specific to breast cancer, although we acknowledge that the predominant category will be breast cancer. These will be adult patients up to and including age 75. All patients in this study will be receiving active drug. This is not placebo-controlled. We'll be studying each patient over a 9-month period with 4 study visits. Actually, study visit 1 is divided into 2 pieces, so it's actually 5. It is a non-invasive study. We're using a variety of technologies to study what's happening at the skin level, but doing it non-invasively. And we're doing studies with the blood samples to try to understand in better molecular terms what's happening. We have, like many clinical trials, we have a lot of exclusion criteria as well. Basically, it's to make sure that the population is homogeneous, that they have actively treated lymphedema, that the lymphedema treatment is stable, that there are no other medical conditions that are going to get in our way of assessing things. And of course, we're not going to work with people who are actively pregnant for all sorts of reasons. So I'm going to conclude there. When I entered the lymphedema realm, basically, you heard, I was told, and everybody was told, that this is the sewer system, and the only thing we could possibly do is get rid of all the junk that's clogging up the sewer system. And if that didn't work, oh well. And I didn't believe that to be true. And I'm happy to say now, 25 years later, I believe we're on the brink of what will be a workable therapy that, if all goes well, within a relatively short period of time, will be available in your neighborhood drugstore. I know I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm talking to an audience of Canadians. The study is being done in the United States, but the intent is to market this internationally ultimately, and to develop it in the international markets, including that of Canada. I don't know what will happen vis-a-vis international subjects in the phase 3 trial. That becomes a bit more complex. And the whole reason for designing trials in the way that we do is not to exclude people, but to make sure that the trials are carried out to completion without a lot of obstacles. So in Canada, you may have to wait to be the beneficiaries of all this work rather than participating actively in it. But I do hope at the end of the story that we have something that we're going to be able to deliver to everyone. So thanks for giving me the chance to talk a bit about this. And now I guess we can start with questions that you might have for me, and then we'll double back to Catharine and make sure that we get all the questions answered on her presentation as well. So does anybody want to be brave and ask a question?
There are quite a few that are in the chat. Yeah. So Barb was asking about how widespread is caliper monitoring.
How widespread? It should be very widespread because it's completely non-invasive. It's very reproducible. It's very accurate. But unfortunately, clinicians certainly, but also investigators who have chosen to investigate lymphedema clinically have been way too focused on limb volume. And it's obviously a representative measure of the severity of the lymphedema. But the problem is, by the time we're dealing with stage 2 and stage 2 lymphedema, which is the vast preponderance of patients, there is such a significant adipose component that that's not going to respond numerically in a very dramatic way within the average patient within a short-term trial of 6 or 9 or 12 months. We need to be looking at endpoints that tell us in the early on experience that the drug is working. Eventually, we'll learn how to deal with those longer lived problems associated with lymphedema. So I'm a big advocate for caliper measurements. We're doing it routinely now in my clinical practice, but even more importantly for this trial, we're using dermal ultrasound. So we use an ultrasound probe that is placed very lightly on the skin. We can do it both on the lymphedema arm and the normal arm. We can do it very reproducibly in exactly the same location on repetitive visits. And we are seeing dramatic effects within the skin. We're seeing dramatic effects of lymphedema untreated, and we're seeing the lymphedema respond as we give the drug. So I can't say it officially because we're not quantitating anything yet, but most assuredly, patients are responding to the medication. And it's just a question of demonstrating the magnitude of that so that we can move forward.
We did have another question. I don't know who it's from. It just says iPad, but it says, will this drug, once approved, still have the same effect after lymphedema liposuction?
Presumably, yes, because again, we know that there are tremendous, so liposuction is removing an aspect of the tissues which we would call the subdermis. The dermis is everything between the part of you that gets a suntan and the fat that develops within the limb. So the fat is the subdermis, the suntan layer is the epidermis, and what's in between is called the dermis. The epidermis is thickened, but it's a layer of dead cells. So the only reason that the epidermis is going to get thinner is because the dermis is less cellular, so there are less cells that are turning over and becoming dead cells. But the dermis, what we saw in the mouse and what we see in the humans is that thickens by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-fold. And that's all part of lymphedema. And even if you take the subdermis out, which is the fat, the dermis is going to be left behind like the skin on a football or the rind on a grapefruit, and it will respond, yes.
Another question, will this drug replace microsurgeries?
Well, replace is a strong word. I don't have side-by-side comparisons. I'll say a couple of things. They're both kind of conjectural. One is that microsurgery is certainly not a panacea for lymphedema in the sense that if we look at the aggregate data, microsurgery has a success rate of short-term success rate of maybe 80%. That's the biggest number I would give it. So 20% of the people who go through surgery and a year of healing will feel like nothing happened to them at the end of that period of time. The other 80% will experience a broad spectrum of improvement. Yes, some will get out of the garment or nearly out of the garment. Others will say, yeah, if you really ask me to think about it, my skin might be a little bit less stretched than it used to be. It might be a little softer. Now that's considered a success. That's a big price to pay for, I'm not sure, but I think it's a little bit better, right? So that's surgery. The other piece of it to conjecture is, as I told you, what we learned in the mouse and what we think is going to be true in the human is that blocking LTB4 actually restores lymphatic repair mechanisms. In other words, new lymph vessels are going to grow. And my ideal scenario is going, sure, if I'm not a surgeon, so if I can get rid of surgeries, yay, I don't want people to do surgery. But worst case scenario, we still need surgery because it's not a cure-all, this drug. But what I know about the microsurgeries is that just like when you plant crops in the soil, you want to be planting in fertile soil that is going to help them to grow. When you do microsurgery, you want the surgical field to be fertile and to be able to respond to that surgery by creating from the donor side, if you will, what needs to happen. I believe that one day, once we've proved that this drug works, every patient who goes through microsurgery will at least go through a course of this drug therapy to create the best possible environment for a good surgical response. Now, that's presuming the drug actually works. That's presuming that one day we can prove that it actually, does what I'm conjecturing it would do in the surgical environment. But every theory tells me that that should be the case.
Wonderful. So another question, if the ketoprofen helps with the LTB4, would this also include damage to the duct area?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
I don't know. I'm going to ask Leslie, do you mind coming off of mute and just elaborating on your question, please?
I have damage to they think at the supra clavicle trauma car accident.
Okay. So you're saying there's some question whether the thoracic duct is damaged? Is that what you're saying?
They say it's not, they say it's thoracic duct, but it's not thoracic outlet. They can't do anything.
Those are two different things.
Okay.
Well, the first thing I would tell you is that at least in the US environment, if there truly is macro damage to the thoracic duct, or what's called the lymphovenous valve, which is where the thoracic duct enters the blood circulation, we have procedures to fix that but with an interventional radiologist. I don't know that the drug, just like let me give you an analogy. If you have coronary artery disease, I'm going to give you a cholesterol lowering drug. That's not going to rebuild your aorta if you have an aneurysm. For that level of damage, something needs to be done to repair it, if it's repairable. Now, there are so-called endovascular procedures where a radiologist is able to put a catheter into the thoracic duct and either put a stent or dilate or do things to reverse that. Now, would the drug potentially help if you have lymphedema on that basis? Undoubtedly, if it works, it will help, but it's not going to restore everything.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. No problem, Leslie. Christine was asking that you mentioned that the drug has an influence on fat cells as well. Is there any chance of consideration for research on lipedema patients?
Absolutely. I wanted to mention and didn't yet that the FDA, of course, has allowed us to do this clinical trial, and that's, as showed you, very tightly regulated set of observations, with a lot of reporting to the FDA. But because the FDA is impressed by the tremendous needs here and also by our science, they also approved for us to run at Stanford what's called an expanded access program. So for people that have lymphedema who don't fit under the rubric of the trial, but we think might be suitable candidates to be using an investigational drug, we can use it as if it's a prescribable drug. We take care of the patients clinically, but we're able to use the drug and observe their responses. And that is what Catharine is going to be working on this summer with me as part of the ongoing process during the time that she has in between studies. But we're thinking very seriously with the sponsor. We currently have that set up for non-cancer related lymphedema. But we're thinking very seriously with the sponsor about creating a parallel expanded access program for lipedema with exactly this consideration in mind, that lipedema is the intersection of a lymphatic problem and an adipose cell problem. And we feel that maybe aspilostat will have dual functionality there and help us with the whole problem. So stay tuned. I mean, I suspect that we'll be crossing that bridge in 3 to 4 months once we get a bit of experience with the expanded access in lymphedema. We're thinking about a lot of categories. We'd also like to I would like to potentially think about head and neck lymphedema from cancer, which affects 50% of the lymphedema of the survivors in that cohort, and they really don't have very good strategies at the moment. So that's another area that we're thinking about. And we're thinking also about expanding to cancer-related lymphedema that isn't part of the so all of those are potentials. I'm going to have to clone myself because it's a lot of people to take care of and observe and watch. But, our zeal is there. We just have to figure out, do we have the resources? Do we have the time? And does the FDA let us do it? Because each one of those will require another round of discussions with the FDA before they approve it.
There's literally so much to do. Sonia wanted to know about what is the natural purpose of the LTB4 molecule in the body that you're blocking, and as well as with the drug, what could be possibly the side effects?
Good questions. The first part is to say that LTB4 is an inflammatory molecule, but I'm assuming this is the case in Canada. I've never driven in Canada, but I assume you have highways and you have access roads to the highway like we do. I assume so. What I wanted to say is that LTB4 is like the access road to the highway. It's not the main inflammatory autoroute, but it's a potentiator. So when you activate LTB4, you make innate inflammatory responses get bigger. And basically the function of LTB4 is to call inflammatory cells into the tissues where it's being made. So if you block LTB4, you're not going to block the ability to have an inflammation, but you're going to block the exuberant inflammatory response, which is kind of like a smoldering fire that happens in lymphedema. Because of the lymphedema, the inflammatory mechanism never gets extinguished. It's a little bit like long COVID, COVID creates an inflammation in the body, but the inflammation is meant to help the body to kill the virus. And then it's supposed to go away. And in a few people, because things go haywire, it just keeps going and going and going. That's what LTB4 does in lymphedema. It just potentiates the ongoing nature of the inflammation. So the answer is, in the settings in which we're looking at it, it seems to do very little on the negative side of the equation. Side effect profile is extremely benign. We see a few people, every drug in the book will give somebody the same list of symptoms, whether it's gastrointestinal, upper respiratory, rashes, et cetera. We see the same sort of list happening, but it's happening extremely infrequently. It's very mild. It's very reversible. So obviously any individual patient who would take it long-term would need to be tolerant of the medication, but we haven't had to withdraw anybody from our trial because of symptomatic intolerance. And in the 500 or so people in the world that have taken ace-bilostat for a variety of reasons in drug trials, it's been very well tolerated, and there's really been no major, it's not as dangerous as penicillin, let's put it that way, where 1 in 30,000 people will die just because they are allergic to it, right? So we haven't seen anything like that yet.
So the last question that's currently in the chat is just how effective would the drug be in regards to lymphedema of the upper extremity, the hand?
Well, presumably, yes. If it's going to work in lymphedema, it's going to work in lymphedema. Theoretically, wherever blood flow goes and lymphedema exists should be a territory of response. We don't know that for certain. We are not specifically interrogating the hands of the patients because it's very hard to get as reproducible measures as we can going from the wrist upward. And most measures of volume exclude the hand, again, because of the irregular geometry of it. And we are measuring volume as well. But we're very interested in what happens to the hands, of course. Having hand lymphedema does not exclude somebody from it, but you don't have to have hand lymphedema to be in the trial. So at this point, we've gotten really late into the evening, but I want to give Catharine an opportunity to wrap up her side of things, if that's okay. And then maybe everybody can go do something fun.
Absolutely. Catharine, did you have anything that you wanted to share, or I'm trying to go back into all the chats and see, I think the biggest question came from just
I see one from Sonia and one from Kelly.
Yes, you got it. Go for it.
So the first question was just whether our respondents for the study was this Alberta-wide, Canada-wide, Americas, worldwide. And the answer to that is, the study was open to everyone. It was made available via social media. And that was done in partnership with Learn, which is an organization based in the US, but is, internationally reaching. So there really was no restriction in terms of geographic area. Just to begin with that question. And then the other one here from Kelly was just, can you please provide more information regarding pre-treatment compression? And it says patients were provided with a compression garment pre-treatment. And that is, so just to confirm that part of the question, yes, that's the concept is prior to initiating cancer therapy, it would have been a patient being given compression. Dr. Rockson, did you want to speak to that? I know, our Canadian guidelines actually have one thing, but just to your clinical experience.
Yeah, so there are no US guidelines, to be honest, but I think the prevailing concepts are, number one, we believe that there are certain activities and situations in which theoretically risk can be reduced if somebody is at high risk. So it is quite common to talk about airline travel, high altitude travel, and strenuous exercises, 3 specific settings in which lymphatic load will increase and you can unmask lymphatic damage that has been silent up until that point. I hasten to say that the efficacy of any of this has never been proven. This is all empiric. It makes sense, and we don't think there's any harm associated with it. So it is considered good practice to give a breast cancer survivor follow either immediately prior to treatment or maybe after the surgery, a compression sleeve to use under those circumstances. I will add to that, and something that horrifies me that it's never talked about, is most of our patients these days undergo radiation therapy. And during radiation therapy, there is often fairly dramatic, as many of you probably know, fairly dramatic burn of the skin, huge inflammation. That's a huge burden for the lymphatic system to be involved in the repair of that, which I'm sure relates in part to the reason that so many patients emerge with their lymphedema during the radiation phase. I advise my patients, and I think it would be good practice until proven otherwise, that during the course of radiation therapy, the prophylactic compression sleeve be worn on a daily basis as if lymphedema is there. Will it prevent lymphedema? Absolutely no, of course not. But if you can reduce the likelihood by 50% or 30% or even 10%, I think the difficulty or the disruption of wearing the sleeve is relatively minimal compared to what can be gained. So I generally tell people to wear the compression sleeve from day one of radiation therapy on a daily basis, take it off at night, until all visible evidence of skin inflammation following radiation has resolved. So that might be an additional 2 weeks after the last treatment, or a month, or 3 days, whatever it might be. But once the inflammation is resolved, then they can revert to the standard risk reduction model, which is wear it when you go up in a plane if you're inclined to do that. The other point I need to make, for those of you that are not aware of this, the reason for airline travel being a problem is when you travel in a commercial plane, whether you're traveling from Calgary to Toronto or you're traveling to Beijing, doesn't matter the distance, the plane goes up. If you're at sea level or wherever you are starting, it goes up to 35,000 feet, and they pressurize the cabin to 7,000 feet. So you ascend 7,000 feet in altitude over about 10 minutes, and then you descend 7,000 feet in altitude when you land. And if you've ever taken your toiletries into the cabin of the plane and you get back to your hotel room, it looks like somebody's been playing with them, right? That's what's happening in your body. The fluid that's supposed to be in the vascular compartment gets sucked into the interstitial compartment, and the lymphatic system has to clear all of that. Now, your lymphatic system can do that everywhere in the body that it's not compromised. But if you've had breast cancer treatment and you're functioning at a lower level in the left arm, let's say, if that left arm swells, that may start the LTB4 fire right there. And the whole reason for the sleeve is to minimize the likelihood that that will happen. You don't want, I like to think of the at-risk lymphedema limb like somebody hanging off the windowsill, going to drop to the ground if they let go. If that person uses all 10 fingers, maybe they can stay there. But if you pry off even one finger, they're going to fall, right? So going up in the plane is like prying fingers off. You're just increasing the burden of the work that the lymphatic system can no longer accommodate. So as I said at the beginning, we can't prove it. And if a patient says to me, I hate the idea that I'd have to wear that in the plane, all I want to do is say, look, I want you to understand why I'm recommending it. It's your choice. I can't prove it to you that it will work, but if it were I would do it. That's the best I can say. And when we're in the absence of data, we have to use our best thought process where we weigh theoretical risk, theoretical benefit, and decide whether we're doing something good or bad.
Absolutely. There was a couple questions about the drug. If you want to expand on it, they're asking about, is there a hope that the drug will replace traditional treatments for lymphedema, or would it be in conjunction with it? Is it affordable? And then the last one would be, obviously, I'm hopeful for this, that it would be seeking Health Canada approval, but I'm assuming once things sort of progress in the US, that it would expand a little bit internationally, at least north,
Yes. So I think the goal of Celtaxis is to market a drug ultimately internationally. Whether the filariasis patients in India ever get this, that's a whole other question. But I think in the North American climate, shall we say, I expect it to be available in Canada. I don't know what its affordability will be, but I'm not a business person. I have no business relationship beyond them, sponsoring the trial, so I don't know. So what was the other part of the question? Oh, will it replace therapy? At the moment, it is an add-on at the maintenance phase. So that's the best I can say at this level of investigation. I think there will always be a role, I shouldn't say always, for the foreseeable future, there will be a role for lymphedema physical therapy, because there are things that a drug cannot do. And the question is, would it be a perpetuator of the positive response to physical therapy? Will it prolong the benefit in between sessions? Will it eventually be given preventively to categories of patients that are deemed high risk? These are all questions that need to be answered. Nothing's going away just yet. These are, this is just putting something in place that we've long needed to work alongside what we already have. And then we'll figure out how redundant, everything is. There will always, please don't worry, you will always have a job, but ultimately at the end of the day, we want to take good care of our patients, right? When vascular surgeons started being less needed to do open repairs of arteries, they learned how to do it with catheters, because they still wanted to do something, even if they weren't going to be paid to do what they primarily trained to do. There may be some reorganization of the activities based on what's needed in the new environment, but it's not going to go away, in my opinion.
I don't think there's a single lymphedema therapist that I know that would be sad to lose their job if we could resolve a lot of the lymphedema problems out there. So we're not technically worried. I think we're more on board with trying to get the results as well, and 100% excited about the potential. So Diane, did you want to finish everything out here for our presentation?
Yes, of course. I just want to thank Dr. Rockson and Catharine for educating us tonight. I've learned things about this trial and what Catharine's doing. And I just wanted to tell Dr. Rockson that when you got Catharine, you got a good girl there. I tell you, you took her away from us. So, and thank you.
I consider myself very lucky, but she's only on loan. She's coming back.
Okay. And thank you to everyone that came on the call, and it will be recorded. And hopefully you'll join us for our next lymphedema night. But again, thank you very much, Dr. Rockson and Catharine.
A pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.